name is Togan Karbalai Ali. I am the Washington, D.C. Director of WDC site, and we are very excited to have Amelia Martin from Senior Engineer from Kittleson and Association today. Amelia is going to talk about things that might not be necessarily engineering, but we need the most to be successful. I'll just give a very brief introduction on Amelia, and then I'll give it to her to share her experience and knowledge with all of us. Amelia has decades of experience competing and coaching debate teams, which has provided her with invaluable rhetorical experiences. Her work experience has included access management policy and manual writing, small area planning, corridor studies, conceptual intersection design, alternative intersection evaluations, quick build design, traffic calming, planning and design, and traffic impact studies. Amelia, thank you so much for accepting our invite and presenting your workshop for us today.
Great, thank you, Sogand, and I'm very grateful to be here today with you all. Let me go ahead and start sharing my slides. Hold on just a moment. Okay. All right, and Sogand, can you see that all right?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. So again, thank you all for joining today. As Sogand said, I'm Amelia Martin and I'm a senior engineer in Kittleson's Reston office, and I'm here today to talk to you about the elements of persuasion, or what exactly the Greeks, rhetoric, and transportation engineering and planning have to do with each other. As Sogand said, I have several years of experience both competing myself and coaching others. And I found it to be really helpful in my personal life as well as my professional one. So just to give an overview of what we're doing today, I'll talk a little bit about the value of persuasion, particularly in the work we do and as being ITE members. Then I'll give kind of an overview of its history, where it really comes from, the different modes of persuasion, and kind of describe what each of those are in an engineering context. And then we'll really move into the main workshop activity. That should probably take about 40 minutes for the workshop activity. The overview that I provide will probably be about 10 to 15 minutes. And then I just wanted to close with some final thoughts at the end for folks. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So I first wanted to cover the value of persuasion in the work that we do here pretty quickly. And there are two dimensions that I want to cover. First is from an ITE perspective and why we're really having this discussion, in an ITE setting. And it really comes back to sort of the purpose of ITE and what it tries to do for its members. And one of those is to provide skills that we have, to kind of take into our work with us. And the ability to communicate and persuade is definitely a skill that's really important to the work that we do, specifically because we're working in the public realm and we have to interact with the public who may not understand all of the technical work that we do. The second piece is the desire for ITE members to shape the future, and really persuasion in being able to present yourself well definitely has made a huge impact on my career and being able to shape the future not only for myself, but for those around me. So being able to communicate well really helps you stand out as a leader, and I think most people would agree with that. And then third and finally, ITE wants to add value for its members. So this, I think, is a really unique offering to discuss, the value of persuasion, and it may not be something that we have time to cover in our everyday, day-to-day work. So I think this is a really important topic, and I'm glad people are taking the time out of their days to delve into it. As transportation professionals, there are just a couple of other things I wanted to note. First is that we're dealing with very technical concepts that the layperson isn't going to understand very easily. So it's really important that we learn how to lay out these technical concepts in a way that is understandable and very simple. That way we can communicate better with decision makers and the public as a whole. The second is that we're dealing with an area that has very personal implications for people. So while we have these technical tools that allow us to, analyze and understand problems, at the end of the day, people's lives are impacted by the choices that we make. So discussions can become very heated. And learning how to navigate that difference between the emotional response of the people who are using the transportation systems that we design and the more logical and technical angle that we are coming from is really important to be able to make those things work together and understand that we're coming from different perspectives. And then the final piece is that in transportation, of course, we are dealing with some complex decision-making processes, and in many ways, those can be just as complicated to understand as the technical concepts themselves. So being able to wrap our heads around those decision-making processes and project delivery processes, then also be able to communicate them back out to others is really important and critical. So what are we talking about today in terms of persuasion? The model that I want to use is one that was first introduced to me as a student in speech and debate, and that is this idea of persuasion. So this happens to be a pretty Western model and way of thinking about communication, but at the end, in my final thoughts, I'll provide more of an Eastern perspective, just a different lens through which to view communication. But for now, I have found this idea of persuasion to be very helpful. The first thing to know in persuasion is that the roots of it really come down to a book called Rhetoric. And it's a little bit of a misnomer to call it a book because it wasn't actually written originally. Rhetoric was initially developed by Aristotle in approximately 320 to 370 BC. And at the time, there wasn't really a whole lot of writing going on. These practices and ideas that Aristotle came up with were largely happening through open forums where people were discussing openly with some of his students. And that's how they ended up coming up with the model that we'll be looking at today for how to persuade others. So just keep that in mind. I find it interesting that this is sort of treated as a book that people sometimes look to, but it really came from an oral history that was passed down and eventually found its way to paper and has really permeated the rest of our lives. All right, so what constitutes persuasion? One of the first things that Aristotle did when he was coming up with sort of this practice of persuasion and the idea of rhetoric was establish different modes of persuasion. And I absolutely love how this matches up with what we do as transportation professionals, because we think about the different modes of travel, right? You have an origin and a destination, and there are multiple ways that you can get there. And persuasion is the same way. You have, a starting point and an outcome that you want to get to, but there are multiple different ways that you can speak with people to get to that outcome. So in this case, in persuasion, I wanted to highlight 4 different modes. The first is ethos, which is an ethical appeal to people's sensibilities. The second is pathos, which is an emotional appeal. The third is logos, which is logical. And then the fourth and final one that we'll cover today is kairos, or what I like to call timeliness. I will note that typically in my training, we focus mostly on the first 3, ethos, pathos, and logos, but I have found the kairos piece to be really important in a professional context because the timeliness and the relevance is what really gives people a sense of needing to take action now to get to the outcome that is desired. All right, so now let's go ahead and look at each of those different modes in a little bit more detail. And the first we'll start with is ethos, which is commonly referred to as an ethical appeal. Now, I want to make sure we don't get this confused with an idea of right or wrong. When we're talking about an ethical appeal, it's more about your authority, whether or not you are an authority that, has something important to say on this matter. And there are three different things I want to highlight about ethos when it comes to our profession specifically. The first is the technical knowledge piece, being able to understand these technical concepts, where they come from, how they have evolved over time, can give you a lot of ethos in a professional setting, especially if you're able to explain them and explain where the standards we use are coming from. The second is what I like to call kind of the letters that you can put behind your name, the PE, the AICP, the PMP. All of those communicate that you have spent time and you have practiced and you have dedicated yourself to learning these important topics. And that gives you some authority to speak on these issues. And then third and finally is really what I find the ethos appeal comes down to is trustworthiness. And in many cases, I think about this a lot in the work that I do in making sure that I am using consistent approaches as much as possible, because sort of flip-flopping and changing the ways that I am responding in certain situations can undermine my trustworthiness, because people feel like they can't anticipate, what my response is going to be. So those are just three things I wanted to highlight in terms of ethos. All right, the second I wanted to cover is pathos, which is the emotional appeal. Now, this one can be a little bit trickier in our context because we want to balance that out with using the correct technical approaches. And really, as members of ITE, that's where our focus should be, is on the technical approach, and we shouldn't be getting into emotional discussions with the decision makers and with the public. However, I do think it's really important that we show that we are emotionally invested and that we care, that we're not just putting down numbers on a piece of paper. So there are three different things I wanted to highlight so that way you can help to communicate that pathos to other people. The first is to be engaged. A lot of the time it can be really difficult, specifically if you're at, a public meeting where people are frustrated and you in turn also get frustrated. But the more that you can calm yourself in that moment and stay engaged and listen attentively, the more pathos those people are going to feel coming from you, because you're staying engaged in that moment. The second piece is the confidence. I think most people would understand that communication, specifically public speaking, can be really difficult. It can be hard to feel confident, but over time, it really just takes practice and learning and understanding that you don't have to have all of the answers at once. So I find some very meditative practices to be really helpful in building that confidence in moments where, the temperature raises in the room. So I always try to remember to take a deep breath, and then from there, the confidence will rise within you. The third and final piece that I like to highlight with the pathos is to be passionate. And I think we can do this as professionals in a really appropriate way by showing that we love what we do. We recognize that the work we do is something that impacts our own daily lives. And that's part of why we're doing it. We're not here, just to punch a clock every day, but we're here because we care about the work that we do. And I think that is a really important piece of pathos that we can bring to the table. All right, logos, or the logical appeal. This is the one that we're probably most familiar with as professionals. We know that the work we need to do needs to be technically sound, but there are other pieces to that as well when we start to communicate that out to others, within our own teams and then also externally. Some ways that you can project a sort of logos for others isn't just in, getting down into the weeds of details. Often that will make things more complicated for other people. Instead, it's more important to be clear, to provide clarity for people and be specific in what you are trying to convey. And the third and final piece I wanted to cover is to be organized. You may have noticed as I speak, I like to say, there are 3 things I want to highlight here. And then I say first, second, and third. So those are ways to stay organized to help people follow you along in your processes as you're speaking and as you're presenting. So organization really comes down to the order in which you say things, and also being able to provide verbal cues for when you are moving on to a new topic. All right. And then the fourth one is Kairos. And this, again, is one that wasn't used a whole lot when I was doing speech and debate, but I found it to be really important in the working world because it comes down to timeliness. And there are 3 things to highlight here. The first is that you understand the timing and how the project fits into the larger timeline of what's going on within an area or within a neighborhood. The second piece is to be aware of context. This can be difficult for me as a consultant sometimes because we'll be working in an area that maybe I don't live or I've never been to before. So it's really important to take some time to understand the local context, to reach out to folks who know the area and to take their input seriously. And then third and finally is sort of this strategic piece. I found this to be really helpful in projects where, we know that something is going on with another effort and maybe there's an opportunity to coordinate between the two. So being able to understand, again, that timing and the context that's going on allows you to be strategic and take advantage of other efforts that are already happening rather than starting from scratch completely. And being able to communicate to that someone, whether it be, a colleague, a stakeholder, or the public, it makes sense to people in that context to say, oh yes, why wouldn't we take advantage of the timeliness of this situation? All right, so with that, I just wanted to bring back a reminder of the different modes of persuasion: ethos, pathos, logos, and kairos. Now, while I've talked about each of those 4 separately, I would note that there are many cases where they really do overlap, and very rarely do you have somebody making an argument. Oh, hold on 1 second. We've got a little feedback here. Oh, looks like we got that covered. Okay, so back to what I was saying about the 4 different modes and how they overlap. Very rarely do you have somebody who is making just one singular argument, and most of the time you are better off if you use multiple modes, right? Just how we try to be multimodal, especially in an urban context, and accommodate all modes, we want to do the same when we're communicating with people. Because everybody is wired differently, everybody is coming from a different perspective or understanding in life, and different types of arguments are going to appeal to them in different ways. And so I think it's really important for us to remember that, while we may be communicating from a place of logic, that may not always be reaching the people that we're trying to convince and the way that they are going to be convinced. Over time, I've found in interpersonal relationships that understanding these kind of models also helps me understand the other person that I'm speaking with. And once you start to learn what makes the most sense to the person that you're developing this relationship with, you learn how to tweak your modes of persuasion to them specifically. And that really can open up great communication with them and be of great help. And the same for me as well. If somebody is trying to convince me, but they aren't speaking to the modes that I like or the modes that are most convincing for me in whatever topic that we're talking about, I actually try and help them out. I say, actually, you're going to be better off if you make your appeal in a more logical sense on this topic. So go back, think about it, and then come back to me, and then we can maybe have a little bit more of a productive discussion. So just a couple of things to think about, in your professional relations and presenting, but also in sort of your interpersonal life as well. All right. So with that, we are ready to move on to an activity. Perhaps before we do that, I might open the floor to see if there are any questions from folks so far, any clarifications or something people would like to share. All right. Hearing none, let's maybe go ahead and move into the activity. So I thought what we would start with is an activity or a scenario that is near and dear to my heart, one that I have run into multiple times. And we will set it up like we have a scenario. We will sort of role play who we are in that different scenario and kind of come up with arguments and put them onto a chart just so we can see, what types of arguments are people making and what categories do those typically fall under. So the scenario that we'll start with is that you're at a community meeting recommending the removal of parking in an urban neighborhood. And so first, I want us to think about what arguments do you make to convince them to support this action, and think about all 4 modes. Which modes would be most effective? And then the second piece will be what arguments do community members make to oppose this action? And again, thinking about all 4 modes. And instead of, if it's helpful for you, if you like me have run into this situation before, it may be helpful for you to just recall the things that you have heard. I've done this activity before with some colleagues and have heard some really great stories. So with that, I'm thinking folks can either go ahead and pose their comments in the chat just by clicking on this button and then going ahead and typing in. Or if you feel comfortable speaking up, which I would really encourage you to do since this whole workshop is about speaking, feel free to go ahead and raise your hand and I can go ahead and moderate. With that, I will be taking notes on the different suggestions that folks have. All right, great. Neil, we've got our first victim.
So I'm going to handle the timeliness item. And when I look at something like this, I'm assuming it's related to something else. I mean, it's not that typical that we're just going around removing parking, but if it's in relation to repaving, a new project, a bike lane, I guess that's how I would try to sell it is this is our opportunity to do that. The opportunities don't come up very often. And what other benefit are we getting at the same time? Are we getting it that it's low cost? Are we going to get a bike lane? Are we going to get wider sidewalks? Whatever we're getting. And it is timeliness because if you don't do it now, your next opportunity might be far in the future.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, looks like we've got a couple of people lined up. Let's go ahead and go over to Chirian.
Sure, sorry, I don't have my camera on. Yeah, it's a great question. And we're just going through a situation as such where I work for the city of Frederick, we're looking at ADA improvements. And in this case, we have to remove some parking to provide for an ADA crosswalk, and certainly we can use some of the logical appeal to persuade the homeowners to move their parking to the alley behind, and we're very certain that they will use all kinds of emotional appeals to us to keep that. So this is something that and a real example that I just want to share.
Yeah, that's great. I would say that also maybe falls a bit into an ethos appeal, since it is, I believe you were saying in your case, it is tied to ADA requirements. So I would also make a sort of appeal to the authority at play there with, this being kind of a requirement from the government.
Certainly, yeah. The other piece that I forgot to mention is that the necessity to remove the parking was also a line of sight issue. So just want to make sure that the parking doesn't impede with the safety aspect of that crossing.
Right.
Good one. Thank you.
All right, Sagand?
Hey, I can think of recent changes in DC for streeteries and how we removed so many parking. So it might just fall in timeliness, but it's temporary. It's for your business to thrive and keep up in COVID. It can also be in logical in a term that, for example, if it's in a residential area, we can make the argument that it's for the safety of intersection, or it's for pickup drop-off so people don't block the bike lane. So I think we can start with saying that, oh, I'm frustrated with parking myself. I understand that how important it is to have this spot reserved, but also, like, you're not the center of work. There are so many other activities happening, and to accommodate that safety or just business or stuff like that, we need to either remove this like parking permit or just change it to something more dynamic like pickup drop off.
Yeah, that's great. I also think another thing that you could do with the streeteries example is, I think this is a rare case where you could also make an emotional appeal, regarding, these businesses are having a hard time and we're just trying to be responsive, to the pandemic and find a way for people to still continue living semi-normal lives. So I think that is a case where there is a bit of an emotional appeal that can be made. Although I, like I said before, I prefer to try and stay away from that as a professional. Another piece that I have found really helpful, specifically when talking about safety or, benefits of certain types of treatments, is to look up, research that has been done and to actually be able to provide numbers related to, this kind of treatment according to FHWA results in an X%, decrease in fatalities, or being able to provide numbers when to back up sort of these logical arguments that we're making. So it's clear not just that you're making a claim, but you have some data and information to back up your claim as well. And we have somebody from FHWA here to weigh in.
Yeah, and this is Louis Graham. I'm actually with the Office of Federal Lands Highways, so I'm not with the big FHWA traffic or safety or operations. But I think just kind of a comment, and I'm not sure which mode category it may fall into, but dependent upon the type of neighborhood you're dealing with and the age of that neighborhood, questions to be posed would be, well, do any of these dwelling units even have off-street parking? Or is the only parking option curb parking in this community? That's point one. Point two is, are there any requirements under the current zoning code of that city or county, depending on the location, for what the minimum number of parking spaces needs to be, as opposed to the maximum number of spaces that could be provided?
Yeah, that's really great. As you were saying that, I realized it would be more helpful to add this sort of context piece onto the Kairos, because really what you're speaking to, I think, gets to that. It's not necessarily the timeliness, but it is the context of where you are and what the land use is and what's appropriate. So that's a really great point, and one that I've heard people mention before in this kind of workshop. All right, I'd be interested to hear anything on this side in the column, either things you have heard or even said yourself. You know, we are also community members, and we are also humans that experience, you know, transportation. So curious to hear if there's anything people would put into these columns. All right, Neil.
Okay, so I work for Fairfax County Department of Transportation, and one of the things in my section is on-street parking. So we hear all the arguments about any change to on-street parking, including it's not fair because we need that parking because we have kids, or we have elderly people living here, or we have someone that comes to take care of my mom. It's going to affect property values. Sometimes even just changing the parking, the complaint can be strangers will park there and it's unsafe. I mean, we hear a lot of different arguments, and to be honest, a lot of them are emotional when they're coming back to us. Sometimes they give us more logical arguments, but a lot of them are emotion. What am I going to do about my elderly mother whose caretaker parks there? And that type of thing. It's very rarely someone just saying, well, it's more convenient, so I like it, because I don't think they think that's a winning argument.
Yeah, that is a great point. I find it really interesting too how you say they think that's a winning argument, and then we're sitting over here on this side and we're saying, well, actually, it's the logical stuff that we really kind of use as our backbone. So I feel that's interesting. And one thing that I have noticed, you know, when I go to provide input for any sort of community meeting is I know the process, you know, right from this end. So I approach it so much differently than my neighbors do, because I don't speak from a place of emotion. I try to speak from a place of logic. So I find that really interesting. I wonder if people had more of an opportunity to understand how things really work, and, you know, how we have to be fair and equitable in our processes, if they might change their track a little bit and not be so emotional in the ways that they try to convince.
Right, and just adding on to what Lewis said, it is true that if folks come to us with very logical reasons based on land use or the history of the area of why we should not change the parking, that is something we'll listen to, and it will impact our ultimate decision of what we do. You know, a lot of times we do make proposals to change parking and then don't, due to reasons that are brought to our attention.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing. Sugand.
Neil, I can think of this idea that you are not only taking parking from them, you are taking auto mode from them. Because why we need parking? Because we start from our origin with the car and we go to our destination, and there is a parking waiting for us, and vice versa. So if you want to take day parking as a public sector, you have to offer them something in return. Oh yeah, we are adding this bus stop near you, or there will be metro station that is adding to the schedule, or anything that can work as an alternative mode, because it is not only about parking, it's about one mode of transportation that maybe is more frightening to lose.
Yeah, that's great. And I remember somebody else making that same point before, as it relates to, you know, what benefit are we getting in this trade-off? All right. Tim, let's go over to you. It's good to see you or hear you again.
Hey, good to see you. Tim Kutz from Fairfax County. Yeah, so I guess one would be a counterpoint to the benefit that we're saying that they're going to get. So if it's a bike lane, well, why do we need a bike lane? There's a bike lane 2 streets over and nobody uses it. Trying to understand some of the long-term benefits of something like that might be a challenge in some cases.
Yeah, I think that's a good logical approach, and really that can kind of go either way. I think most of the time it would probably be, us as professionals making that argument, because we actually have more of the access to the data to know whether or not a bike lane is getting used more. But in a lot of cases, there are gaps in how much data we can actually collect. But yeah, that's a really good point. I'll just put that down as data collection. Another piece I have heard before is not just what the trade-off is if you're putting in a bike lane, but doing a parking study to figure out what the utilization is, and is it actually even being used, and can it therefore go away? So that's another sort of logical piece that would fall into that kind of data collection approach. All right, Lewis.
Yeah, another topic that might come up, I'm not sure exactly where you want to put it on the community point side, but the whole concept of transportation equity. If you look at that example of, well, we're going to remove your parking from your local street so we can put in bike lanes for other people, who are you taking that parking away from? And what benefits are they seeing by having somebody else, some higher level of government, say, imposing some particular desired travel mode upon the choices that people have already made?
Yeah, that's great. And I will say, I had this happen recently where I was reviewing community comments, and you're very used to hearing people talk about how things are going to impact them and how terrible it's going to be. But somebody had put in a comment related to their neighbors where they said, there are a lot of folks in the area who don't have cars and have to travel non-auto modes. I hope that their needs are being considered. And I have to say, for me, at least as a consultant, that was more persuasive to me to hear somebody advocating for somebody else rather than just for themselves. I think that's also an important thing that is helpful if you're on the community side, if you're not just advocating for yourself and your needs, but you are mentioning the needs of others. That I find to be a little bit more persuasive. Chirian.
Yeah, one of the point that I think it's more strategic from the city. The way we approach this is sometimes where we had to move parking from a street to an alley. We try to make a case, or we even have some residents come back to us to get an access from an alley, because they see valuation of their property increased by having a driveway off an alley, or not a street parking, but their own dedicated parking. So the resident or the owner felt that having an access from the rear increased the valuation by $15,000, $20,000. So a lot of times we've used that as a carrot to kind of persuade a homeowner or to have a block of parking removed, to say, hey, city will help subsidize your constructing a parking pad to the back rear. We've used some of those kind of approaches to kind of carrot and provide some incentive to kind of persuade. Just want to put that out there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have not heard that approach before. And I can see totally why it would be effective. I'll definitely be thinking about that in the future, to be looking for incentives in some cases where it might be called for.
Yeah, we've used it at least 3 or 4 streets or locations where it became really the valuation of the properties where really a lot of the residents kind of found that, especially if they're ready to sell the property or something like that.
All right, well, maybe while people are thinking, I can share a couple of points that I have heard from people before when I've done this exercise. I'm interested to hear folks' thoughts on these. One that comes to mind immediately, because I remember I laughed out loud a little bit the first time I heard it, was making the specifically, for me being a consultant side, I think oftentimes we fall into a trap of saying, trust us, we're the experts. And in some cases, that maybe carries some weight if you are working with people who know a reputation or can appreciate the work that's being done. But in other cases, I think that can actually backfire on you a lot. And at the same time, I've definitely heard community members kind of make the same point. Well, we're the ones who live here and we know what it's like every day. And I will say that I think is persuasive for me, at least, because there's only so much data that we can collect, only so much information that we can get. And there's a reason that we do public involvement and engagement. It's to get that sort of local understanding of what's going on. So I think it actually does kind of cut both ways. So I'm interested to hear if other folks have had experience with that or any reflections on those sorts of appeals to ethos. All right, Lewis.
Well, this is Lewis, and I'll offer some commentary over the course of my career, which goes back several decades, as several of you on the call probably know. Personally, I would never offer that point. Trust us, we're the experts, unless you want to have a group of people start laughing at you if they have a positive response, or booing if they have a negative response to that. I think you're better off if you're saying, okay, I'm here. I have been hired by the city, the county, the state, whoever the client is, to examine this situation. You're the people that live here. You have to experience this situation every day. I don't. So when we start talking about potential problems and issues, forget about alternative solutions, just what are the problems or issues? Here's a blank map. I want you people to sit here and fill out what you see as problems and issues, and tell us what your concerns are, what you perceive the problems are. We'll list those, we'll talk about those, because we're here to serve you. Even if our check's coming from somebody else, we are here as servants of the public because we are educated professionals.
Yeah, I love that. And I think a better way to phrase, oh, we're the experts, we've been doing this a long time, is to say, we've worked in other communities that have probably similar problems to what you're having. We've been exposed to a lot of different issues in different contexts. So let us use that information that we have from other areas that have found ways to solve similar problems. That I think is really what you're trying to get at when you're saying, oh, we're the experts, we've been doing this a long time, we've been exposed to this in many ways. It's more about we have experience and understanding to offer you to figure out, what you need and what's going to be best for the community. Neil?
Yeah, I want to add to what you're saying there. That is actually an argument we use quite often. And I agree with you. We would never say we're the experts, but we often have folks in a neighborhood, let's say, if we're going to do traffic calming or parking modification, that they will be predicting dire consequences, what's going to happen. And we do use the examples quite often of we've done something similar in 100 neighborhoods, and here are the results that we have found with regard to, let's say, speed or traffic volumes or stuff. Now, of course, they can always have a different result, but I think that's a pretty strong indicator when you say we've done it, 10 different streets in this area, and here's our before and after studies. So it's much more compelling than saying it's based on our knowledge. It's not, it's based on our data. So.
Yeah, I talk about this all the time and think about it all the time when I'm putting together a document or putting together a presentation, is provide as many numbers as possible when you think you're making a logical argument. The best way to back that up is, not just to claim something, but to have information that backs you up and warrants that claim. That makes those logical arguments so much stronger and so much more convincing.
Yeah, I mean, it really does take it out of our opinion versus someone else's opinion. We're just presenting the data. Now, some people then question the data. We don't believe it, but that's a different argument than we have a different opinion. So.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for bringing that up. All right, we've got a couple more minutes before I was going to move on into some closing thoughts. Anything else that folks wanted to observe or provide, talk about with the group? Tyrion.
Yeah, if I may. Yeah, just generally about the trust us, we are the experts. So, it's not related to parking, but a thing often comes up during speeding, which is we go to a community meeting where everyone would just say, oh, speeds are way about the posted. But there is always a silent majority. At least in one meeting, somebody spoke up and said his comment was that no, the speed is not posted high enough. So, or it was for 35 people in the room, one person saying, or somebody going back home and saying that, hey, I drive that road every day. The speed I see is at or below this posted speed limit. So it was always a silent majority who's out there who recognize that. I mean, it's always great to get that feedback, but yeah, I mean, on a really a charged room, they may not be brave enough to speak up oftentimes, but those comments do validate, I think, in a way, beyond the trust us, we are the experts, but I think we're trying to give them the right information, and people do appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I have run into that as well, and that is another thing that can make these processes very complicated, is when there is disagreement within, the people that we are serving themselves as to what they want. And that, just adds a layer of complexity on how to navigate that process. But, as to be expected, again, people are different. They come from different walks of life and have different needs and things that appeal to them. So it's all part of the joy of the work we do. All right, with that is actually a good transition into the last couple of thoughts that I wanted to share with everyone. So let me pull a few things up. And again, I just want to say thank you for taking time out of your busy days to join. I really do enjoy talking about this stuff, in case you can't tell. And the input from folks, I think, has been really informative for me. Some ideas that I'm thinking I will take away with me. So I hope you've gotten something from this as well. As I said before, these topics that we were discussing and sort of the model that we used to sort out different arguments is very Western in its nature. But I wanted to provide a different perspective that comes a little bit more from Buddhist practices. In these really, difficult times of social isolation and loss and racial equity, I have sort of been needing to find some peace myself in conversations. And now, as we find ourselves moving into this world where, people are grieving, dealing with great loss, coming back out of social isolation, and trying to think about how we make a better world for everybody, I wanted to give you all some thoughts that have been helpful for me. So the first I wanted to share is to grant yourself and others grace. We all make mistakes. This has been a really difficult time, and anger and hurt are valid responses and have their place in this process. Once you have given those valid emotions acknowledgement, granting yourself and others grace and acceptance will allow you to move forward. But you first have to acknowledge those feelings without invalidating them. The second is to think about what you're trying to achieve in your communications. Are you trying to understand? Is this an appropriate time for healing? Or is this a time for persuasion and convincing? Each is valid and has its time, and you will achieve the most positive outcomes when understanding is completed and you have clarity. There is danger in trying to persuade before you reach clarity, but it is also natural for us to try and jump ahead in these processes. So see number 1 to grant yourself grace when this inevitably happens. Number 3 is to begin discussions with availability, both logistically and mentally. How stressed is everyone right now is a question that I try and ask myself. How stressed am I? Is this a time to understand, grant grace, heal, or to persuade? And I also like to ask myself, can conditions accommodate the needs of the moment? Number 4 is to seek first to understand. And I find it really important to do work myself first to try to understand before I ask others to explain. When you ask them to explain, be sure to think about number 3. If they are not available logistically and mentally to explain, asking them to do more work for you may make them feel even more stressed and hurt. Number 5 is to prioritize for yourself and ask those around you to prioritize. Every day, it seems like life and work gets more and more complex, and there are so many things to balance. And with so many things happening around us, it can be hard to know what the current moment is for. So take a moment to ask yourself, does this really need to be done now? If people are asking you to do too many things at once, try and see number 2. I found it helps if you open communication with people and bring understanding that there are only so many things that you can do at once. And then number 6, which is one that I am still working on, is to set healthy communicated boundaries. We are always in a position to help and be helped by others. But if you do not set boundaries, it's really easy to fall to either extreme. To give without taking and to take without giving can both lead to undesirable outcomes. So with all that, just the last thing I wanted to say is it's really important to emphasize these ideas come from Buddhist principles. I didn't come up with them myself. They're not really new at all. They just haven't been a part of the way that we think about the world, specifically in the United States and especially in the professional world. So I had a lot of help to come to these realizations, and I have so much gratitude